I think we're in the life track because we have spent most of our adult lives involved in virtual reality and now augmented reality as well. And one of the things we thought we could do in the short amount of time that we have is really spend some time examining some stuff that we did and others did back in the 90s, as well as looking at present day practice. I first suggested to Linda that we call this panel Meet the Wrinklies, but she said she's not a wrinkly yet, and that's true. However, I am, so meet a wrinkly and a lovely lady. So we wanted to look, we called this thing Trips, Tropes, and Hopes. And the first topic we sort of wanted to look at is the question of how we move and what flow is like in VR. And Missy here has notes. That's so cool. She's got little green cards. Do you see this? That's so cool. Is it your turn?
I'm sorry I'm late, guys. I'm sorry I'm late.
No worries.
880 was brutal.
Yeah.
We know that this is kind of a look backwards, but the whole reason that we're here is actually to convey some learnings in order to share potential strategies, opportunities for increasing the success of immersive environments today, right? Would you say that's
right?
it?
Yes,
That's it, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So you hit the three themes: the movement and flow, right? The bodies and avatars, and then the relationship with place, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I was thinking about and wanted to share with you and get your thoughts was the fact that in the early emergence of VR as a commercial tool, we approached VR as the UI itself. Right now, it seems like a lot of people consider UI a subset of design for virtual environments, but it was a different perspective early on. We saw VR as the UI itself for interaction with computer simulated places or objects or people.
Yeah, at Interval Research, we called it no fucking interface.
The best interface.
Well, the idea was, you know, when I first saw VR at NASA Ames Research, they had drop-down menus in VR. And I'm thinking, what? You go to all this trouble to model a real environment and you've got a drop-down menu?
Yeah.
You know, so that's where NFI came from. I'm sorry,
Right.
Dan.
No, that's exactly it. I mean, we talk a lot now about the subjective quality of immersion in quantitative, measurable, numerical format. We talk about 3DOF, or we argue about 3DOF versus 6DOF, or we talk about 180 degrees versus 360 degrees. We talk about the extent of the field of view or the pixel density, but for enabling immersion, or what we like to call suspension of disbelief, it's important to focus on what VR could do to transcend time and space and scale, not necessarily measured by speeds and feeds. So we focus on using VR as a representational medium for expressing interaction with something or somebody or someplace.
Or somewhere.
Yeah. So back in 1990, Brenda wrote that every new representational medium in its early life is seen through the filter of an earlier representational medium.
That's McLuhan.
Okay, in this case, cinema or games. All right, so can you talk a little bit about the creators who invent and share language of the new medium through old conventions?
Through old conventions.
The old conventions is what breaks the suspension of disbelief.
So were we starting with film?
We were starting with cinema, yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things we learned in the old days, oh look, I can even read it. This is fabulous. Is that jump cuts don't work in VR, even though they work in movies, right? And initially, I imagine they were pretty disruptive in movies, but people got used to them. When you're embodied in a virtual environment, a jump cut is a really horrifying thing.
A teleportation.
And this, I think, gets extended into the present as a convention that's borrowed from film, but which we find in things like the point and teleport UI that the Vive has going on. It breaks flow to suddenly find your body in a different place. And there are various ways you can work with that. But one of the comments that gets made is, well, it's really too hard to render all the in-betweens if we slid you over there. Bullshit. You've got a working model of the environment. It's not rocket science to show us the in-betweens. Also, you can slide people down vectors with scenery streaming by and still get the impression of movement forward. We fly with fingers, or we have the fake UI pad on your hand is just about as dumb as a pull-down menu in VR, as far as I'm concerned. Because you're dealing with an interface within an interface instead of just being present in a different place and taking action and making choices. Next.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to point out that the reason people use teleportation is because it supposedly helps prevent motion sickness.
Yeah, which is also not true. Motion sickness comes primarily from lag. And we're not dealing with very much lag anymore. So I don't believe that the cause of motion sickness in VR is movement through space.
So I'm thinking that you're talking about the use of UI conventions from the earlier representational medium, and the whole approach of teleporting, what is called jump cuts in cinema, is inspired by games. And so games have become the representational medium of inspiration for a lot of the conventions used today, whereas when in the commercial days, the representational media that was driving the development of the ways in which you interacted was flight simulation and cinema to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So so from cinema, that's where you knew that jump cuts were really disruptive and harmful. But in games, that is how you do it in order to conserve CPUs and a bunch of other things.
Yeah, right.
So speaking of conserving CPUs, you want to do that in order to enhance realism as much as possible. Mm-hmm. And in 91, you wrote this, and I don't think you were quoting McLuhan. You wrote, "Now that photorealism is possible, we have the opportunity to question whether it's appropriate to turn up the knobs on every sensory modality."
It is McLuhan.
Immersion is not just physical and perceptual, it is also cognitive and emotional. So can you address that a little bit in terms of flow?
Yeah, in terms of flow
Yeah.
and engagement. What we learned, I think, in early work is that okay, it is McLuhan. So if you're frying somebody's eyeballs and brain with very high resolution imagery, that's a hot medium, right? In your face. If you've got some ambiguity going on, and that's not necessarily low resolution, ambiguity like seeing faces in clouds happens, right? Seeing faces in rocks. Have you all seen faces in rocks and clouds? Those things aren't low res, they're ambiguous to a certain extent. So when we fall prey to the in-your-face photorealism that also comes from the video game world, we're blocking out kinds of experience. It's not all bad, it's its thing. I'm trying to advocate for another kind of thing that might grow our audiences, right? Where there is this opportunity for more engagement with a cool medium. And that includes not only photorealism, but also the use of play mechanics from games in VR experiences, valid, but there's an alternative, right? The notion of game mechanics masks out the opportunity for other kinds of participation. So what are those other kinds of participation? And why, let's start doing some of those. We might get a whole larger audience interested in the work.
So I think of another kind of 1.0 convention for wayfinding or ego motion, going from place to place, was grabbing the fabric of space.
Yeah.
Right, taking your gloves or your controllers or your grippies.
How about your hands?
Or your hands, right, and pulling space toward you, and using it also to transcend scale and time. But we don't see that as often. Make VR has that.
Yeah, Linda did a piece recently that traverses time rather than space, or both, I should say. She worked with elders with cognitive decline with a simple VR headset, and elders with cognitive decline can remember their first address. You know, those old memories stay longer. So tell them what you did.
I was presenting Google Earth, Google Maps Street View inside of Samsung Gear VR, and asking folks who no longer had short-term memory to recall and tell me their childhood or the address or the street name of the house where they had their kids or had their formative years, and then plugged that in, presented it to them, and created a lot of reminiscence therapy.
People were talking.
They were able, They were transported back in time by looking at the current image or one that was shot by the Google streetcar 10 years ago, but in their minds, they had gone back in time. So it's possible to do that.
Timer just came on here.
Yeah, going back in time. Another interface, another way of interfacing that we talk about a lot, a way to get from point A to point B, other than jump cuts, breath, the breath interface.
You may not know this, and if you don't, please look at it on the internet. Shar Davies did a piece in 1994, the year after we did Placeholder in Canada, where she's a diver, and she wanted to recreate sort of the experience of diving. So she created a UI that was an interface device that wrapped around your chest, and when you breathe in, you go up, and when you breathe out, you go down. And that's how you navigated in there. She also made it into a performance piece that was installed at a museum, I think in Toronto.
SF MoMA too.
And at the SF MoMA, so that when the immersant was in this world, you were also watching that person. And they would start like that, and within like a minute, they were doing Tai Chi. It was remarkable what happened to their bodies. And people came out of that experience saying their lives were changed by it. Go ahead. We're running out of time.
Is that an existential comment?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm closer to the end than you.
No, that's enough. That's enough. So, what about tree? When we talk about one of the beautiful piece that Melitza Zek and Winslow Porter created called Tree. That's also a rise.
Have you guys seen that?
Have you seen that?
Anybody seen that?
Yeah.
Tree? So you start as a seed, and the scale trip is amazing. So everything is huge, right? And as you're pushing up, the scale changes, and then when you become a full-fledged tree, it's a whole different deal. But there's a problem, and that is that no matter what you do with your arms, with your branches, there will be slash and burn fire starting all around you, and you will know you are going to die. Now, despair and fear, as we know, have not worked very well in the service of dealing with climate change. We've been bombarded with it. What I challenge those guys to do is to provide affordances for people who participate in Tree to do things that make a difference.
Such as?
Such as ways to stop that fire, ways to protect the birds that are, anything that provides an opportunity for positive agency, which speaks to the problem of trying to embed a story in a virtual environment with a beginning, middle, and end that you authored. When in fact what's going on is, when I'm in a virtual environment that you authored, you and I are having a time-displaced collaboration. And the story is what I would tell somebody about my experience after it's over. And I should be able to go back into your world 17 times and have 17 different stories. But when you try to nail a story into VR, you're reducing agency to the point where a person is actually just passive in a VR movie. So there's a danger in that. Now, you can finesse it, by nudging people to make interesting choices by the selection and arrangement of materials. But nailing it to a specific narrative is always going to be problematic.
Is that a reason behind some of the popularity of like these low fidelity shared spaces like Second Life, because there's less realism but a lot more agency.
Yeah,
a lot more agency.
And social interaction.
Yeah, and so that's something really important to consider when we start thinking about avatars and representation of self inside the environment, like what our bodies look like and how we can control those bodies. So a couple of other things to talk about, which we can continue doing when we run into each other in different spaces here, is the control of an avatar is either first person or third person.
Right. Or second person, go there, avatar.
The God's eye view, which is one way of controlling it, and then there's being it. Yeah. So you and
Guess which I'm in favor of.
Which are you in favor of?
Being inside the damn thing. I mean, we noticed early on, and when I started working at Atari, that girls played pole position like crazy. They've always enjoyed first-person games. And when you can see the car, it takes away from the engagement. We tried it both ways. Okay, so if you're in the car, it's very different from watching the car. Go ahead.
Yeah, and similarly, years ago, I performed on stage as the voice and the personality of a 3D computer-generated puppet that was animated in real time using motion capture and also the sound of my voice opening and closing the mouth. But the face, it was just like a bunch of shaded polygons that looked like a stylized African mask. It was neck up, and I like hid behind a curtain or under a desk or was somewhere concealed and could watch as people interacted. Smart adults interacted with this bunch of polygons that were called Rigby for RGB. And what was remarkable was the immediate engagement of people with this animated figure, my avatar, despite its low resolution and lack of detail, the liveliness and the immediate interaction and the responsiveness to the other person's input would draw other people in. So watching from second person, right, a second person perspective, watching an avatar and an individual interact in real time, just the agency alone enhanced the suspension of disbelief, let people just forego the fact that it was a bunch of pixels on the screen and start to interact and watch others interact. So that's really effective in enabling a sense of immersion.
Tamiko Teal has a piece out right now that I think it launched last week that is doing that. So there's a live actor with avatars. It's different. There's a live actor with computer animated avatars. Computer generated, computer smarted, whatever. Yeah.
There's so many ways that these types of strategies could be implemented in applications from entertainment and media to enterprise and education, and we continue to be really interested about the strategies for human-centered interface design in these incredible environments. So we are announcing that we're starting a company called Skylight Strategist to work with people focused on human-centered design, really interested in enhancing outcomes, audience retention, and audience growth. So Brenda you're going to be splitting, but I'll be around for the rest of the conference.
Yeah, I even made her business cards in there. And we have our website is up, skylightstrategist.com, and we're hoping to help. Do VR for good and bring forward some of the things that we think we know.
Thanks for being here, 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.